I think anybody who works a job will have those moments where they're just like, I hate this job and I want to quit. And then you're like, well, what am I going to do then? And when I was 21, where my mind went to was, I'll just live in a monastery.
Okay, you did that. You did do that, yeah.
And now I'm like, I did that. I don't have that as an option anymore.
Hey, welcome to Japan Station. My name is Tony Vega. All right, so first of all, Happy New Year. If you're listening to this soon after I upload it, well, it's January 1st or soon after. I hope you have a great 2019. And stick around because there's a whole lot more coming on japankyo.com for the podcast as well, Japan Station, of course, and a couple other things that I'm working on. Hopefully, if they come together, I can talk about it more in the next coming months. Also, just one quick news bit. Japan Station is now on Stitcher, on Google Play Music, aside from Apple iTunes. So if you're not into Apple and you prefer other platforms, you can go check out the podcast there. You can subscribe, leave a review. That really helps the show keep growing. So go do that. Okay. Once you have an extra moment, you can go type something up, right? Would really, really appreciate that. As for today's show, we're talking all about Zen. Yes, the Buddhist religion. Is it a religion? I don't know, but my guest will certainly tell you. So my guest is Gesshin Claire Greenwood. She's a Zen priest, and she spent over 5 years training, practicing, studying Zen in Japan. She wrote a book about it called Bow First, Ask Questions Later. It's a really funny, interesting, thought-provoking book. And she's a very interesting, funny, thought-provoking person. So we talk all about, her experiences in Japan, being a person who can't speak Japanese, spending time in a very, very difficult place called Niso-do in Aichi Prefecture. It's an all-women Zen monastery. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but at times it sounds like a labor camp. Like, it's a really, really tough situation that these people put themselves through. But there's a lot to learn from that, and there's a lot to learn from her experiences. And it's really interesting listening to her reflect on her experiences on these very, very difficult situations. Also, we talk about a few funny things, especially this one story that she tells about when she moved from one monastery to another, and she had to do it in a full traditional Buddhist outfit, and she had to ride the bullet train and have everybody stare at her. There's more to it than that, but I'll just let Gesshin tell you the story because it's pretty funny. And we also talk about Koan, so those crazy Zen questions, like what's the sound of one hand clapping, right? We talk about one specifically, which is about a monk killing a cat because another monk didn't put sandals on his head. And it causes Gesshin to totally zone out. Anyway, I think she saves it in the end, and but you'll still kind of get to listen to me faceplant in the middle of an interview. It's pretty funny though. But yeah, it's a really, really great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to her, and I was actually kind of nervous to talk to her. I mean, I'm usually a little bit nervous to talk to people, but just given the way she is, she can be kind of snarky and wisecracky at times. And I was thinking, oh goodness, if I ask the wrong question, she's gonna say, well, that's a dumb question. But she didn't say that at all. She was actually very nice at the end, and I really, really appreciate that. Okay, thank you, Gesshin. So anyway, enough of me. Let's get to the show. Here's Gesshin Claire Greenwood.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
I read the book, and in the beginning of the book, you talk about this the story of this old lady Zen master, and she just wants to make tea, but she has this hot poker because people keep asking her about Zen and whatnot, and so I kind of feel like you might want to poke me with that poker after I get done with my questions, but hopefully I don't bother you too much.
Hopefully, you get some tea out of it.
Exactly. So I guess we'll just start with like a really basic question. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that ended up leading to you deciding to go to Japan and study Zen over there?
Yeah. Well, I do write about that in the first couple of chapters. But I grew up in a Buddhist family, although my parents practiced in a different tradition and were more kind of, Northern California style, eclectic hippie version, I guess. And then, I wasn't actually so interested in Zen by itself or in and of itself, but I had my boyfriend at the time had stayed in a monastery in Japan, and so I was talking about it, and it was already something I was really passionate about, Buddhism in general. And then in 2009, the stock market crashed, and so we went into the recession essentially. And I also had a good friend who died very suddenly and randomly. He was hit by a falling tree branch. And so that was, both of those things were very, well, I guess his death more than the stock market was very, tragic and shocking to me. And so I kind of wasn't able to live a normal life. I sort of tried, but I couldn't. And so I found my way to Japan through, connections I had to this monastery. And luckily it was a place where, foreigners could live, women could stay. And I went there for just a little bit of time, and I just stayed. Yeah. that's what I tell people. I went and I stayed. I just never left, really.
And so was there something there that you found enjoyment or satisfaction in, or was it just like, this is what I'm going to do and I'm just going to stick it out, so to speak?
Both. It was absolutely both. Because, that's actually a good observation. I think it was both. I remember writing in my journal pretty early on, I don't know why I feel so peaceful here. Because all I do is sit zazen and work and sweep the floor. And then I kind of had this like aha moment because, that is the whole point of Zen practice, essentially, in the monastery, is that you're just sitting, you're just cleaning. So I would have a little tiny break after lunch, and I would go out walking in the Japanese countryside and feel this really incredible peace. And in retrospect, I think part of that was just like the beauty of it, the nature of it. So there was that piece, and then there was also I was 22 and I was in this stage in my life where I was having a really hard time becoming an adult, and I had all these, emotional problems, mental health issues. So I really felt like I needed to figure out my life and figure out myself. So I remember sitting, I think I write about this, sitting in the Zendo, crying from physical and emotional pain, but being this is it. I have to do this now or never.
Right. So actually that kind of made me think of something else. You mentioned in the book how some people say, Zen isn't a religion, right? It's this kind of just people just practice. It's ceremony, so to speak. And so, people just meditate and you just work. So what is Zen then? Or you could even boil it down to what is Zen to you. It doesn't have to be some, just general Zen. I guess it can vary from person to person, perhaps. I don't know. That's kind of an amorphous question, perhaps. But
there's a lot of ways to answer that. And in the book, I do have a chapter where I argue pretty, polemically that Zen is a religion. I say, if it walks like a duck and and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And I am talking about Zen and how there's altars and people bowing and a lot of the stuff in this book is, like I said, it's polemical. Like I'm being sort of provocative on purpose because I am a brat, and so it's just like how I am. But then I was commissioned to write some material for Tricycle magazine the other day, and I was writing like the "What is Zen" card. I really do think it is different things for different people. For some people, especially in Japan and in East Asian countries, it's primarily a way to engage with community. It's about respect for elders and connection to family. For others, it will be about zazen, and it'll be more of a way to find psychological well-being. For others, it's about awakening and enlightenment. For others, it'll be, just kind of what they're doing all the time with their life. Yeah. I think, so it's hard to connect those threads, but I think if I was forced to, I would say it is, it's a recognition of how the universe is. And a way to live your life that is in align with the truth of how the universe is, which is that we're all connected, which is that we are living out a dualistic experience, etc.
That's very interesting in that. Yeah, like because the general stereotype, right, is that it's a bunch of old guys on a mountain doing like sitting meditation on hours on end and asking each other kind of like crazy questions that don't have an answer, right? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, when you explain it that way, it's a much more like basic thing, and you go like, oh, okay, well, what about the crazy questions?
Good. Yeah, well, I'm glad. I think part of why I wanted to write the book and I enjoyed writing the book is, I did, especially practicing with nuns, with women. I got this like really special view into just how practical Zen is and like how basic and it can be. It's not complicated.
Right. So I'm curious, you spent I think it's Toshō-ji, right, the first place that you were at, and that was in Okayama. And then you, after about how long was it that you moved to Niso-do? I think that was in Nagoya or Aichi, right? Aichi Prefecture. Yeah.
Oh God, I'm getting old. I'm 31, by the way, I'm not old. I think I was there for 6 months, and then I left for a little bit, and I came back and was there for another 6 months or a year. So maybe like a year and a half I was there, and then I moved to Niso-do and was there for 3 years.
So there's a bunch of questions that I have about that whole transition and all that, but I think first I want to ask you about the actual physical process of relocating from Toshō-ji.
That's a better question than the why, which is you'll just have to read the book. And...
Yeah, we'll leave that's the why. I think you can read about it. It's interesting in and of itself, but that the kind of picture you paint of your physical like moving from Toshō-ji to Niso-do in Nagoya or Aichi, right? It's a pretty funny, interesting story. Could you kind of retell that?
Are you talking about the faxed drawing of the backpack?
Yeah, all that stuff and the bullet train and all that.
Yeah. So if you are in Japan, you may have seen unsui, the novice monks, traveling with these special, they're called kesagōri, and so it's very hard to describe, but it's like a backpack, but it also has a front. It like goes over your shoulder, and there's a thing in the front as well. Yeah. And it's a way to carry, like in theory, you're supposed to carry everything you own with you in that little tiny box. Yeah. And it includes money for your funeral. Okay. If you were to die in the monastery. Seriously,
wow, that's old fashioned, huh?
Yeah. So actually, they made me like put money in. Oh, I know. I just remember. I don't think I wrote this in the book, but I didn't have any money, so I wrote like, in case of emergency, like contact this number. in case of death. Anyway, so yeah, you're supposed to have this, and it's like very challenging to set up, and it's also it's not part of your normal training to know how to do this box. So and like nobody knows.
Is that like a wooden box or like what? It's
the box itself. Yeah, is like lacquer or maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it's wrapped in all these different cloths. There's these various ways of this specific way to wrap it.
Yeah.
So the day that I left, the abbot of the monastery wasn't there, and he was the only one who knew how to do it because nobody.
And he was the one that insisted that you do it this way, right?
Yes, exactly. So, but then there was like his disciple who sort of knew how to do it. So he like helped me put it on, but it wasn't really the right way. So I did. He helped me put it on and kind of like sent me off. And I went like to the trains, and then you're wearing these weird sandals, and like there's these like weird white shin guards. Anyway, and
robes and the hat, right?
Robes and the hat, exactly.
Yeah.
So I took the bullet train like that with the and they shipped. So I had other stuff that they shipped in those like big plastic containers, and thankfully, as you know, like. It's very easy to ship things in Japan. It's very cheap to send things to the post office. Anyway, so I get to my ryokan that night, and I take everything off, and then I'm like incapable of putting it back on the next day when I actually have to arrive at the monastery. So I frantically call the abbot, and he tries to explain it to me, like how to put it back on, but his English is not good, and my Japanese is not good, and so he draws out this like really, I wish I had kept it, this really immaculate drawing of like how, and with like arrows and like step 1, step 2, and then faxed it to me, and then I managed to get it back on, the pack back on.
Yeah.
And in the book I draw this metaphor of like, that's what Zen practice was to me, is like not like having to put on like this strange backpack with only instructions, like faxed instructions by myself. And but I eventually made it to the monastery, but ironically or not, I was the only one to actually arrive that way because all of the Japanese nuns don't do that. So I was like a foreigner in the most traditional Japanese outfit.
Right.
Of course, that's my karma. Yeah.
And then I think like you weren't sure like which house, which place was, because they all kind of just look the same to you.
Right. Yeah. I think I actually did go up and like ring the doorbell of, it was just some family's house, because I was like, this is a temple, right?
It's a crazy foreign lady. It's like,
in this weird outfit.
Yeah. Yep. So you mentioned, you didn't really speak Japanese at the time, and yet you were practicing. You ended up practicing for like 5 years, was it in total? I mean, towards the end you had studied Japanese, and I'm sure it was very different from the beginning, but you mentioned how that was one of the many difficulties that you had to face, right? Not knowing what people were saying, and you were getting these lectures, but you couldn't really learn from them because you didn't really know what they were saying. So that seems to kind of tie in with the whole, bow first, ask questions later, right? You were just doing things, you were working and kind of just suffering through everything. So it seems like that was something really tough, but in a way, was it also somewhat helpful? Could you say that?
I mean, that's interesting you bring that up, because I think you're right in a way, like, so there's that famous phrase, carrying water and chopping wood and carrying water, that is sort of the heart of Zen. So before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. This sense that Zen is about your physical action and your participation. So in a certain way, I did get kind of a easy access to that really immediate embodied practice, because I didn't have the language to attach to. And so, that did allow me to participate in a certain way. But I think ultimately, I mean, it's so much better to know language so you can communicate with people. And so much of spiritual practice is about connection to others. and especially I think clergy, we're helping the community, ideally. So by the end of it, I did know Japanese, and I could go out to, do the memorial services, and I would talk a little bit with people in the houses. So that was really rewarding.
Mm-hmm. So what was the transition like from being at Toshō-ji, the first place that you were at, to then Niso-do? Because Niso-do was much, much tougher, it seems. Like it was much stricter. And, the way you write about it, you came many times, it seems, to like, you were seriously considering like committing suicide, and it was like really, really tough. So what was kind of that transition like, and what were some of those difficulties that you found when you went to the new place?
It's really, really tough. And most Westerners don't do what I did for a variety of reasons. I think mostly Westerners come for 6 months or so, because usually when foreigners come, they're looking to get their certificate, the training certificate, and you only need, like Japanese monks, you only need a minimum of 6 months in the Soto. But that wasn't my aim ever. I wasn't looking to get certified. I just wanted to practice. So I did stay longer. It's hard in all of the ways. Things can be hard. It's physically hard because you're sitting seiza all the time. You're either sitting seiza or sitting like cross-legged. Meals are in seiza. So physically, it was just a huge adjustment for me. And then you're sharing a room with 5 other people, sleeping on the ground. So absolutely no privacy. And then I really wasn't used to the like senpai kohai system. I think as an American, that was particularly challenging. I think the Japanese nuns did have a little bit of a head start with that. I had kind of had to learn what that was about. But some things, to be honest, Japanese people all had the same challenges as me. Like I saw Japanese people get like horrible blisters on their feet from the seiza and like have to go to the hospital.
Really?
So it's kind of and drop out or run away. Like I saw one nun run away. So it's hard for everybody.
Yeah. So I remember you talking about water, right? The conservation of water and what there was to learn from what on the surface seemed like, why are they going to these lengths to conserve water, right? So like what were they doing with the water, and what was it that you learned from that? What can we learn from that?
That's a nice question. Well, water shows up. I was reflecting on this recently because I'm in a graduate program to become a marriage and family therapist, a psychological counselor. And in sort of Freudian terms or in psychodynamic terms, water often shows up as a metaphor for the id, which is like personal desires. And I didn't know this at the time, and that's just kind of the Western psychological view of it. But water came up so many times in the Dharma talks and sermons. So just, practically in the morning you get up and you go to the basin and you have a little pail or bucket kind of, and there's a specific way to turn on the water, and only enough that you can wash your face and do what you need to do, and then a specific way to pour it out and all this. And so, I write in the book that it was teaching me how to, live with just enough to take care of the things that were around me. But I think water, there's a lot more I could say about water, and maybe the water is also about, the human spirit. That's what the Western psychological study is showing me, that I think that water represents life, and so when you're conserving this water, you're learning how to take care of life take care of your life.
Right. So it wasn't just like with the brushing your teeth, but it seems like in many other situations there were times when you didn't do something right and you would get like severely scolded. Like, you know, almost like why would they go to these kind of lengths, right? It was just seem mean at times. Like and yet, like, your idea of a monk or a nun is this sort of benevolent, always caring, nice person. Like, how do you like come to terms with that? Is that paradoxical? Is that just because we're all human and we have these like moments that we kind of take out our frustrations on people, or like what how do you like look at that now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually just wrote a paper about this today. So this is on my mind.
Oh, okay.
You know, I think all religious communities, this goes beyond Zen and Buddhism, all religious communities have this habit of dichotomizing things into good and bad. So in Buddhism, you know, desire is bad, selflessness is good, sex is bad, celibacy is good, etc., etc. Right. There are all these things, right? But yeah, human beings are comprised of good and bad. And so when you have so much attention put onto trying to do the good thing, the parts of yourself that are unwholesome or dangerous, they get ignored and then they get repressed. And so when they're repressed, they'll just pop up sort of violently in other areas of your life unless you're actually attending to them. And so my experience is that for the people who were very mean, it wasn't everybody. You know, there were some people, and I do write about people who were incredibly kind and generous and helped me a lot. But for the people who were kind of cruel, I think it was just that they were ignoring the parts in themselves that were full of desire and kind of trying to push that away, instead of having a more kind of integrative approach to human consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think that shows up, to be honest, in all religions, and it's why you see so much like abuse in the Catholic Church. Yeah, it's that.
I think it's interesting because you mentioned, for example, one nun that was particularly mean to you, and then she sent you that bouquet of flowers at the ceremony, right? Yeah, at the end. So, I mean, do you see that as her kind of repenting in a sense? Like, was that her sort of apology?
Well, I have a line in the book, and I think it's my favorite line in the whole book, which is that I don't know if it was... What do I say? I said, I don't know if it was an apology or a congratulations. Just like I don't know if what I was feeling was sadness or gratitude. So I don't know. Right. I think that's why I mentioned it, is because I think maybe she was feeling mixed things. And I was feeling mixed things too, because she did help me, you know. She helped me in a lot of ways. So... it could have been both. And definitely I feel to her now a mixture of gratitude and anger.
But that's interesting that, you know, for some people they would always get stuck in that anger, but you can at some point kind of distance yourself from that and look at it from another perspective and see, well, she did do something for me and I can be grateful for those things.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that was one of my biggest developments in the monastery, was this ability, like learning to hold contradiction and to see that human beings and experiences are multiple things at the same time, and that the negatives don't get rid of the positives. You know, like it was this incredibly challenging experience, and I, you know, became stronger. I learned so much about myself, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of, and I think really that is the thrust of the book for me, and why I think it works as a book, or I hope it works for people who haven't had that same exact experience, as I'm trying to show that, like, this is what life is. It's complicated, and, you know, gratitude and anger get mixed up together, and you have these experiences that are intensely bittersweet because they are both painful and pleasurable.
Right. You talk quite a bit in one chapter about enlightenment being a male endeavor.
I think I say male fantasy. Yeah.
Oh yeah, male fantasy. Yes, that's exactly what you say. Yes, and it's particularly interesting because we're talking again about the whole transition from going from Toshō-ji, where it was mixed but mostly male, right, and then you go to Niso-do, where it was all women. Right, and the women's nunnery, I guess you would call it. It was just very, very hard, very tough, very and yet. The male, it's a male fantasy. So like could you kind of explain that and what you were trying to say through that?
I'm so glad you brought that up because I just recently published Buddha Dharma magazine, which is a magazine in the US or in the West, republished that chapter and it's online now. So if for the listeners, you can just Google enlightenment is a male fantasy and it'll pop up.
Perfect. It's very interesting. I think it's worth checking out.
Anyway, so it was posted on Facebook and Twitter and it was reposted like 300 times, which for Buddhism is a lot. And there were right. It went viral in Buddhist terms.
Right.
And then of course there are all these comments from like men who are very angry. But what's so interesting to me about that is like, yes, I was writing about gender and I was on one level writing about how practice looks very different for men than for women. And that what I saw is that women were focusing more on just the daily practicalities of living. So, cooking, cleaning, things like that. And so I saw that as more true to the heart of Zen. And I think nuns in Japan agree with me that ask any Japanese nun and they will tell you that Japanese nuns are like holding out the true Buddha Dharma in Japan. But anyway, so on one level I am writing about the men and women. But I think more than that, I think men and women are just kind of a metaphor for any polarity or any kind of binary. And so in Zen, there's just been this huge, millennia long debate about sudden versus gradual enlightenment, right? So is enlightenment something that appears in a flash? Is it an experience that comes suddenly, or is it something we are constantly cultivating in our daily lives? So this is a debate that has been going on forever. It continues to go on. It's another way of describing it is like Rinzai versus Soto. So there are all these ways of talking about it. And essentially that's what I'm talking about in that chapter is gradual enlightenment, is practice realization. Dogen Zenji called it practice realization. So gender is just kind of my way of talking about those things. So I'm curious about Dharma combat, but also, like, could you explain briefly what exactly is to be ordained versus to receive Dharma transmission? And then I know Dharma combat plays a role in that, so it's all kind of woven together, it seems. So in Japan, you ordain and take 16 precepts and shave your head and get your robes. And that means you are a monk or a nun. And then you undergo your training, and that can take anywhere from 6 months to, years and years. And at some point, you do what's called a head monk ceremony or hosenshiki. And that is what you're asking about. That contains the Dharma combat. And so I think, and actually this exists across like sects of Buddhism throughout the world. Like lots of traditions have some kind of Dharma combat. I think, like Tibetan Buddhism is famous for also having Dharma combats, although I think I will put a footnote that says it's sort of debatable if anybody's ever doing it in real time. Right. Because what I learned... So in Japan, at contemporary times, they have scripted Dharma combats. You memorize classical Japanese dialogues, essentially, and then you shout them at each other. It's really fun. So you're just screaming at each other.
So you shout at who? The master, the abbot?
No. So when in the Dharma combat, so you are the head monk, and how do I explain it? So the Ongo is the practice period. It's 3 months long. And so for every practice period, there's a head monk who's supposed to be kind of like leading as an example of for the other monks and nuns. And so to kind of prove or show their worthiness, they're supposed to have a Dharma combat where anybody can ask them any question about the Dharma. Okay. And I think in olden times, it would be an actual combat where people would actually ask you any question. And in the U.S. today, they do it like that, where like everybody can ask a question and you have to answer.
Right. And the Dharma is just the general teachings of the Buddha.
So questions about the nature of reality, questions about scripture. It's supposed to be a time where you prove your knowledge and realization. Of course, at the time, I didn't know anything. Like a spontaneous
thing, right? But
again, it's a debate because the more I learned about this, the more I came to see that even like within the Japanese monastic system, so much of the way people talk is referencing older literature or older texts, like there are these set phrases that you so in debates, like somebody will bring up a phrase and then you're supposed to counter with your own phrase. It's like, so when you study like haiku and how people wrote haiku to each other back in Heian times, like
so they would just write back and forth and refer back to an earlier.
Exactly. So it's like that. So it's spontaneous in that you're creating it, but it's not spontaneous in this because you're using like phrases that have already come before and you're kind of riffing off of it. That's how it's supposed to be ideally. I never got to that point because I am not enlightened. But so I had to memorize stuff in classical Japanese and then also in English. I created my own questions in English. Which is I've never seen that done, to have it into languages with self-created questions. But that's what I did. So that's Dharma combat. And then Dharma transmission happens after that. And I have a couple of chapters towards the end about what Dharma transmission is. I guess the very short answer is it's permission to teach, but it's also permission to have disciples and have your own temple.
Right. Okay, so then you when you pass do you say pass? I don't know, the Dharma combat.
Maybe complete.
Complete. Okay. Then that's when you receive the Dharma transmission.
Yeah, and I mean it's not Dharma transmission is not guaranteed. Okay. But it's kind of the next step in the ladder.
Okay. You talk a couple times, or in particular, I remember the one about the cat, but the koans, right? So these kind of Zen riddles, and they're like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Like that's kind of like the most, the one that people have probably heard of. But you talk about this one about the cat, and the Zen master says, somebody say a word or I'll kill the cat, something like that, right? And then neither of them can say anything. So then the master kills the cat. And then he tells the disciple, like, what would you have said? And then he puts sandals on his head, right? And then the cat lives. He said, if you would have, then he says, if you would have been there, I wouldn't have killed the cat, right? What's that about?
Are you asking what a koan is? Or
no, well, koans are these okay, so let's start with that. How about, can you explain to me what a koan is, and then can you kind of share some insight on that story about the cat and the sandals on the head?
Maybe. Okay. So koans are not my practice. I've done a little bit of them. So a koan is essentially a statement about reality. It's an assertion about reality. And so oftentimes you'll see it in dialogues, so like the one you're describing, or a question and answer. And so your answer would be your statement about what reality is like. And so people oftentimes think that they are paradoxical, but in fact they're not paradoxical, because you're describing reality, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's what a koan is. What are we talking about? Cats?
So,
heads,
and the
sandals?
cat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like what? I know you said you weren't particularly fond of that one, especially. But is there anything you can offer in terms of helping me or anybody listening understand that?
I honestly, when you're telling that story, I spaced out. I'm not gonna... You said Nanzan kills the cat, and I was like, oh, can I go in la 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 la? I mean, would you? Yeah. What? Yeah. I don't know. It's something you want. You want to ask a different question?
Sure, I can try something else.
Well, you can continue talking to me about that. I don't remember how that one goes.
Okay, yeah, the one, the student puts the sandals on his head, and then he says to the cat, I wouldn't have killed the cat if you would have been there, but
okay.
I mean,
so when he puts the sandal on his head, he's making a commentary about how he thinks reality is.
Absurd?
Again, so it's the reason that koans exist in the way that they do is because oftentimes reality is not explicable in traditional language.
Okay.
So you will use metaphor or jokes or physical movement to express something that is not explicable in normal language. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, good. I'm glad I'm glad I can help.
You saved my pointless question almost.
No, it's not a pointless question at all. I just have a block about that koan, which is why
which is why you specifically mentioned it in the book, and you kind of said, I don't like this one.
Yeah. But you know what's interesting about koan? So I have that whole rant about koans where I just say that they're absolutely pointless, right? But then since then, and I have that, maybe it's in the Enlightenment is a Male Fantasy chapter where I say that there's this one koan about sorting the sand from the rice, and somebody's like, oh, do you sort the rice from the sand or the sand from the rice? There's a famous koan about that, and I say that, the woman's way of responding to that kind of question would just be to do the thing. So would be to just sort rice. And so I say that if anybody has a challenge, a dharma combat they want to engage with me about, we should just see who can make more onigiri, who can make more rice balls. And I put a footnote because at the time I was making friends with James Ford, who is a Western koan master, and he had proofread my book for me, and he was like, koans actually do have answers, and then I put a footnote in the book that said, James Ford says that koans have answers, but he refuses to engage with me in the contest of making rice balls, and my editor deleted it. Because
I didn't see that last part.
He is a student of James Ford, and he didn't want me to publish it. But now we're friends, and I've actually done some koan work with him, so I've kind of changed my mind about koans a little bit.
Right. So but basically, I think what I got from what you were saying there and in the book is kind of just do it instead of worrying too much about the words, right? Just do it, right? Make the rice balls. Don't worry about whether you're sifting the sand from the rice or the rice from the sand. It's just the more productive thing is to just make the rice.
That is that's the Soto Zen way. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that I am writing about one particular mode of Zen practice. So Soto Zen is all about the practice enlightenment. So just engaging with the moment.
Okay. So I got just two more things I'm kind of curious about. So looking back at your experience, with all the difficulties and dark moments and, good moments too, but what sticks out most to you today? What kind of still has that you can look back and you go oh, I'm glad I did that, or I'm glad that was an experience that I had? I mean, that might be more than one thing, but,
It's been a long enough time that I sometimes feel like it was a dream.
Yeah. Is there something that you can look back on and think like, oh, or I guess maybe the whole thing, I guess everything shapes who you are, huh?
Yeah, it's everything. It's really, it's totally changed who I am in good and bad ways. So it's part of me. I think, maybe there are specific things like, so for example, maybe this might not be the answer you're looking for, but so I am struggling to have a career as a mental health professional, right? So I'm studying to be a therapist, and I work a job now, like a 9-to-5 job. Oh. And there are days where I work with children with disabilities. And, there are hard days where I get really frustrated with my job. Like, kind of, I think anybody who works a job will have those moments where there's like, I hate this job and I want to quit. And then you're like, well, what am I going to do then? And when I was 21, where my mind went to was, I'll just live in a monastery.
Hey, you did that. You did do that. Yeah.
I did that. Yeah. I don't have that as an option anymore. I have to actually live my life now. I have to, like, the figuring it out part is all the time. So that, I think, is a really important. And now that I'm saying it, that's actually really good that that is what I am understanding, is that the training you have in the monastery, you train within the monastery walls about these specific monastery things, but then you get out into the world and the whole world is your monastery, and there are people who make you angry, and there are challenges, and there are moments of peace and enlightenment, and it's your life, and you have to keep living it, you have to keep doing it, and you have to make the best of it. So that's sort of what I learned in a nutshell.
And so, you kind of touched upon what was going to be my next question, but since coming back to, California and living outside of the monastery, what's your average day like? How do you keep those connections to what you've learned? How do you, do you find time to meditate? Like, what are you doing that still is part of your previous life? Yeah,
that's a great question. And I have gone through some grief about how much I've let go of. Because, in the book I write so passionately about the importance of shaving my head and living simply and all these things. And I have hair now. It's short, but I have hair, and I have television, and I'm married, and we live in a nice apartment. And so there, it's been a big change, and I've let go of a lot. I'm in graduate school full-time, and I'm working a full-time job, and I'm publishing my second book, and I'm doing that all at once. And I think like that, and all of the things I'm doing, I hope are for the benefit of others. And I have learned, this is another thing I think I've learned, is how to get energy from helping others instead of having it deplete me. So Ayama Roshi would always talk about how everything she did was for the nuns in the monastery, and that's how she had so much energy. And sometimes I look at all this stuff I'm doing, and it's like, how do I have time and energy for all of this? And I think that's what it is that it's for other people. And then I'm kind of in a anti-establishment phase. I was part of I still am part of, I was talking about James Ford, my mentor. We were building a community together in Southern California, but part of me is really resistant now to like being in a building. Okay. I'll go out and look at flowers, and I'll sit on a bench and I'll look at flowers, and that is my practice. That's my meditation practice. I do sit traditionally sometimes, but I'm feeling really called to be out of outside. Yeah. So I don't know what I'm in this new phase in my life where Buddhism has stopped kind of being what it used to be, and I'm redefining what that looks like for me. And part of it is what I'm describing as like figuring out a way to live like a sane adult life that helps others. Yeah.
Huh. Can I ask you what the new book is that you're working on?
You
what
may.
Is it about?
It's called, I should plug it while we're here. It's called Just Enough. Vegan Recipes and Stories from Japanese Buddhist Temples.
Interesting.
So it is a cookbook with recipes from the time that I did work in the kitchen.
In the kitchen, yeah.
So it's a cookbook, but it's also a meditation on balance and enoughness. Because I feel like in the West, but in contemporary Japan as well, people don't really have a good sense of what is enough. So I was writing about this for myself too, especially about things like desire and pleasure and, pain, money, what is enough of any of this. So it's a weird little book. It's a cookbook and like a philosophy of life.
Very interesting. So your time in the, on kitchen duty, I guess you could say at Niso-do, you describe it as like one of the hardest aspects of your time there, right? What was it? So obviously it was like really hot, right? And just really strict and super long hours and all that. But it's interesting that you're in a way choosing to revisit that. Yeah,
well, it was really hard, but it's where I learned like everything. Like literally everything. I learned in the monastery. I learned in the kitchen. But also like cooking is everything. It's what keeps us alive, Right. Without cooking, we would just be animals, I guess. And I love food. So it's all of those things. It's practice, but then it's also joy. I think that's also probably why I wrote this book too, because I just love food and I like thinking about it. And so I like writing about it too.
Huh, interesting. And is there a rough date more or less for when that's coming out?
This May or June, I think it'll be published.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. All right, that sounds very interesting. Last thing, is there any piece of advice you can give to people? Any sort of thing to kind of, I don't know, appreciate your life a bit better or something? I know it's kind of a big question, but
don't go to a Japanese monastery. But if you have to, then go.
That's very Koan-like.
Yeah, so there is your Koan. You can.
Okay.
And if you would like me to break that down for you, I can explain. It's not a paradox. I mean it. You should not go to a Japanese monastery. You can learn everything you need to know at an American monastery or in a marriage or at other places. But there are always going to be people who have that itch to. That spiritual itch to discover and to know more about themselves and to push themselves. And for those people, like, the normal life is not going to be enough. So that's why we have monasteries. Yeah.
So basically, you do what you have to do to find that sort of sense of satisfaction in a way, right? That if you feel that need in order to feel complete, to go to the monastery, to go to those lengths in Japan, then that's what you had to do, but not everybody has to do that, right?
Sure, exactly. So I think I guess what I'm saying is like spiritual yearning is so important to pay attention to. It's really what will drive you and give fire to your life. And so figure out where to put that fire, I guess, because it'll make you go faster.
Yeah. So you still write on your blog? Or occasionally?
Intermittently.
Okay.
But, like I said, I'm a full-time grad student and I'm publishing a book. And so it
seems like, Okay, but the blog is called That's So Zen, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we can look that up if you want to. You have quite a bit on there, so great. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for talking to me, and you asked such good questions.
Well, thank you. I was afraid you were going to get grumpy at me.
No, it's really, some people ask dumb questions.
Okay, I think we'll cut it off there.
Before I start complaining about specific people.
Yeah. There you go, that's Gesshin. And again, if you want to find out more about her story or about Zen, and you want to have a good laugh, or just learn something about overcoming struggle, bow first, ask questions later. It's a great book. You can go check it out. I ended up reading it 3 times. I mean, 1, just because it was interesting, but 2, because I really, really wanted to be prepared for this interview. And thankfully, it all turned out good in the end. Gesshin was happy. She didn't tear me apart. So just again, thank you so much, Gesshin. And again, guys, go check out that book. You can also find more information on her on gesshin.net, okay? Or That's So Zen if you look up her blog. All right. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach me via the email, which is mail@japanstationpodcast.com. So you can send me an electronic mail and I will read it. Hopefully get back to you. And of course, Facebook and Twitter. Facebook is @Japankyo. Twitter is @Japankyo News. All right. That's where you'll find out who the next guest is and all the other news and whatever that I upload there. As always, thank you to Yunomi, Yunomi, for the opening and closing song, Oedo Controller. It's a great song. I love it. I still love it. And if you want to hear the whole thing, well, go check out the show notes. You can click on the links that I provide at the bottom, japanstationpodcast.com. Click on the episode. I always include the link right at the bottom of the show notes, okay? Again, if you're enjoying the show, if you enjoyed this episode, please go leave a review. That would be very nice of you. I would really appreciate it, okay? So yeah, just keep that in mind. I'm not going to say who my next guest is because I have 3 or 4 episodes recorded and I have not decided who's coming up next. But suffice it to say, they're all great guests, so stay tuned to social media to find out who's next, all right? I will be announcing that in the next week or so. All right, that does it. So, yeah, thanks for listening, and go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!